Chapter 1821. Yi Liangqiu was so tired that she went to sleep. She was too tired. Giving birth to these two children seemed to have taken up her entire life's effort. She fell into a deep sleep. She felt as if she was floating on a warm surface of water. She was surrounded by warmth and brightness. There was also a pair of big palms patting her from time to time, calling her Liangqiu. The dream was very beautiful, so beautiful that she didn't want to wake up. She slept for a long time. She heard some noises from time to time. It was very noisy. She could also feel that her body was strange. It was as if she was being kissed by some little monster and was trying hard to pull something out. It was very comfortable, very warm, everything was warm. She couldn't bear to wake up, but the little monster on her body refused and pulled with all its might. It was very painful to pull. Finally, she woke up reluctantly. When she opened her eyes, her surroundings were bright. On her left and right, there were two fat little ones lying on her, trying hard to eat. Her gaze immediately became gentle. Her fingers moved gently and she reached out to touch the two little ones. They were chubby like two little pigs. They were really well taken care of. She heard Crispy Sleeve's voice from the side. They were born 3 days ago and you, as the mother, only woke up. You scared us. Yi Liangqiu looked up at Crispy Sleeve and smiled weakly. Aunt Sue, I've made you worry. Crispy Sleeve smiled gently. This child. Aunt Sue, I've been waiting for you to wake up every day. The doctor said that you were just tired and needed to sleep for a while. Who knew that you would sleep for 3 days? Linda, who was lying on the side, also watched the babies eat. She looked up. Aunt Sue, you're always wiping your tears. Hearing this, Crispy Sleeve's face turned red. Her expression became fierce. Linda, don't say that you didn't cry. Don't bully an old man like me who can't take pictures. Otherwise, you'll be embarrassed to death. Linda smiled and begged for mercy. The atmosphere was quite cheerful. Yi Liangqiu looked at this and that, then looked down at the two babies in her arms. It was painful again. However, this kind of pain was also happy. It was just that Anlin wasn't here. She thought of the pain when she gave birth and the voice she heard. She looked at Crispy Sleeve and asked hesitantly, did he come? Crispy Sleeve's expression was a little strange. After a while, she sighed softly. He came, but he left. Why didn't you stop him? Yi Liangqiu sat up. Her body was really very weak and needed Linda to support her. Crispy Sleeve sighed again. How could I stop him? Also, Anlan was afraid that his face would scare the child, so he only dared to take a look before leaving. She couldn't stop him. She didn't tell Liangqiu about this, for fear that Liangqiu would be sad and cry after hearing it. One shouldn't be sad during a confinement period, otherwise, it would be terrible if one's body was harmed by crying. Liangqiu was too. She didn't say anything else. If he didn't show up, she couldn't tie him up. If she pushed him too hard, it would only make him hide even more fiercely. Linda asked softly, have you thought of a name for the child? Ming. Lin said, Sleeve and had Lin. Ling, Sleeve and Luo Lin was a. Sleeve and Tutulin. To say. Crispy Sleeve and Linda were stunned. What kind of names were those? However, Yi Liangqiu always had her own plans. They didn't say anything. So what if it's Anlan? Anlan. As long as she was happy. Yi Liangqiu stayed in the hospital for another 2 days before returning to the apartment. She still missed him in her heart, but with 2 more children, 5 children at the same time, it really took a lot of effort. In addition to King Entertainment, she didn't have time to think about him during the day. She only missed him in the dead of night. Chapter 1822. After a long time, she even wondered if he was still in New York, but she soon found out that he was still there. There was a mysterious wolf on Wall Street, a wolf from the East. Some people called him King. In 2 or 3 months, he swept through the Wall Street stock market and became a legend there. All kinds of reports appeared, and it was the headlines of the financial section every day. But no matter how hard the reporters tried, they could only get a picture of his back. Yi Liangqiu sat in front of the French window in the study. She put down the newspaper in her hand and looked at Kaim. She said calmly, "It's Anlin." Kaim nodded. "Yes." Yi Liangqiu looked at him. "I'm going back to Be City." Kaim was stunned. "Liangqiu, aren't you going to look for him?" Yi Liangqiu looked at the newspaper and smiled bitterly. "Did you see that? He's become a legend again. He always succeeds easily. We can't find him at all now, and staying where he could see her at all times." She thought that he would probably never appear again in this lifetime. After a while, Kaim understood what Yi Liangqiu was thinking. He asked in a low voice, "When are you going to leave?" Yi Liangqiu looked at the sky outside. "Let's wait for early autumn. The maple leaves in Be City must be beautiful in autumn." She said softly, "Kaim, I'm a little tired too. I want to wait for him at home. New York is not my home." Kaim nodded. "Okay." But he still didn't understand her feelings. He didn't know what a woman would do. Qin Anlin didn't appear for the entire summer. It was as if he had disappeared. However, the legend that belonged to him had always been there. Yi Liangqiu subscribed to all the newspapers in New York and cut out the articles about him one by one. She flipped through the pages with her slender fingers and her gaze suddenly froze. She saw his back view as he walked towards a luxury car. His handmade suit made him look even more slender. Beside him, there was a black-haired and pure young woman. She was dressed in an expensive and fitting outfit that wrapped around her perfect body. She was standing beside him and seemed to be talking to him. The scene was completely a drama between a domineering CEO and a beautiful secretary. Yi Liangqiu's fingers paused for a moment. Then, she slowly cut out the article and read it carefully. The girl's name was Zhang Yuanyuan, a 28-year-old graduate of Harvard University from Be City. She searched for a while and found Zhang Yuanyuan's front view. She was a beautiful and intelligent woman. Was he being so high-profile just to show her this? Was he not afraid that this woman would despise his face? There was a rage in his heart, but he had no way to vent it. Then, he and the woman were cut in the middle. In less than half an hour, Kaim rushed in from outside. Yi Liangqiu looked at him. "Help me make the arrangements. I want to hold a 100-day banquet for my child. I want to invite all the famous people in the Chinese district." "Oh yes, please invite Mr. Du Yuexing." He was so shocked that his jaw dropped. But soon, he saw the newspaper that she had cut out and understood. So she had been agitated. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and looked at him. "Is it difficult?" Kaim gulped. "It's not difficult, but I'm afraid that Auntie Sue won't be able to explain it. She's longing for President Qin to come home." Yi Liangqiu also threw a rare tantrum. "Don't I look forward to it?" Chapter 1823. President Qin used to have a harem. "I don't see Mr. Yi getting so worked up." Yi Liangqiu glared at him. "That's not the same." Kaim laughed bitterly. He knew that they were at loggerheads. President Qin had a lot of time. He could have just polished his face and body to make himself look better. Did he have to be like this? Or was there something on President Qin's mind that he wasn't saying? Keim was a man. Naturally, his thoughts ran wild. The more he thought about it, the more likely it seemed. Could it be that President Qin was that? He didn't dare to tell Yi Liangqiu about his suspicions. If it turned out to be true, President Qin probably wouldn't dare to come back. Men cared about their reputation the most. He scrambled to hold a 100-day celebration for Yi Liangqiu's birthday. Keim even found a way to contact Zhang Yuanyuan and officially invited her boss. The Wolf of Wall Street, King. Zhang Yuanyuan was a Chinese-American who had grown up in America. She was proficient in 8 languages, including Mandarin. She got out of the car and closed the door. She walked into the tallest building on Wall Street. King's office was on the top floor. Other than her, there were only a few traders. Her high heels sounded rhythmically as she pushed open the door to a luxurious office. The person inside was wearing a simple shirt and trousers. Although it was hot, his long sleeves were buttoned up, and so was his collar. Half of his face was covered by a silver mask. The other half was perfect. Zhang Yuanyuan had been in America for many years. She had seen many men with well-defined features, even superstars. But King's face still attracted her. At that moment, King was bending over to hit a water polo. He was a mysterious man. She only knew that he was called King and that he had a lot of wealth. She knew nothing else. But she knew that her salary was a few $1,000,000 a year, so she was willing to work with him. She held an exquisite invitation in her hand. She walked to his side and placed the invitation on the billiards table with her long, beautiful fingers. She smiled and said, "Someone gave it to me." He said, "It was an old acquaintance of yours, boss." Qin Anlin glanced at him and asked calmly, "Your name is Keim?" "So he said." Zhang Yuanyuan flipped her hair and tied it into a ponytail. "Boss, are you going?" He handed her the cue in his hand, took the invitation, walked over to the sofa, and sat down. He opened it and looked at it for a while. Zhang Yuanyuan finished the game for him and sat beside him. She smiled faintly. "Do you need me to refuse?" Qin Anlin put down the invitation in his hand and said in a hoarse voice, "Aren't you curious about who it is?" Birthday banquet. How could he forget Liangqiu's birthday? He could roughly understand why she was holding a birthday party at this time. Perhaps she was unhappy. Because of his beautiful secretary. Qin Anlin himself didn't know why he asked the reporters to put up such a photo. Doing that was very childish, like a little trick only a child would play. He clearly didn't want to go back. He clearly wanted to give up. Or, he was forcing her to give up. Now he knew that she hadn't given up. His heart was in a mess, and he didn't know whether he wanted her to give up or not. Zhang Yuanyuan didn't ask. She was waiting for him to answer. After a long time, he finally said, "It's my ex-wife." Chapter 1824. Qin Anlin looked at her, then clenched his hand and placed it on his chest. "She's here." Zhang Yuanyuan understood, and she felt a little disappointed. An excellent boss indeed had a story, and she had also searched for that woman. She was very beautiful. She used to be a movie actress, and she was even very famous in the United States. She was the dream girl of countless men. She had also seen her movies, and she was an unforgettable person. Then, should I reject her? Zhang Yuanyuan asked softly, a little cautiously. Qin Anlin thought for a moment and said, "No." The most direct way to reject her was not to respond. Zhang Yuanyuan did not continue. She knew that the boss needed to be alone at this time, so she smiled and said, "I'll go out first." The boss did not respond, so she knew that he should be thinking about his ex-wife. In fact, the boss often went into a daze. When he was in a daze, he was thinking about his beautiful ex-wife, right? After she left, Qin Anlin picked up the invitation again. He smiled bitterly. She must be very angry at this moment. He still remembered that she had once said that if he dared to have another woman, she would not want him anymore. Liang Qiu, you don't want me anymore, do you? He picked up his coat and walked out. He usually stayed in the suite in the office, but he did not want to be here today. It had been many, many days since he had last seen her. Ever since she gave birth to the child, he only knew that the child was very good, and she was very good. He did not dare to look at her again, for fear that he would not be able to control himself. He had also thought about wearing a mask in front of her, even in bed, but he could not help it. He was no longer the Qin Anlin of the past. What else could he give her? He put his hands on the steering wheel and drove very fast. The high-performance Ferrari was like a gust of wind on the streets of New York. With a screech, the car stopped under the apartment building. He looked up. His eyes were a little wet and hot. That was his home. His wife and his children were all there. She had given him 4 sons, and there was only one little Mumu. He still remembered the feeling of holding that soft little daughter in his hands. After so long, the child must have grown up, and he did not know if he could still remember him. Even if he remembered, it wasn't his current appearance. Qin Anlin closed his eyes slightly, his silver mask flashing with a cold and hard light. No matter how perfect the mask was, it could only cover his ugly appearance, not his twisted soul. He gazed at her eagerly, and closed his eyes dejectedly. Just look at her. Perhaps he could, yes, he could try. The banquet was held on Saturday night, but Yi Liangqiu disappeared on Friday night. He had only gone out for a short while, but he had disappeared into thin air. In front of him, there was a piece of black cloth, and in front of him was gray. Her hands and feet were tied and she was lying on a soft bed. She must have been kidnapped. At this moment, her sense of hearing and smell were extremely sensitive and magnified several times. Footsteps could be heard at the door, and she could smell the scent of alcohol. She could smell the 1982 raffle right away. The sound of footsteps was getting closer and closer. The pores all over her body enlarged. She was extremely terrified. She did not know why he wanted to kidnap her, but to be able to tie her to the bed, she could imagine what would happen next. The smell was getting stronger and stronger, and she could feel that the man had walked to the bed. The smell of alcohol mixed with a faint cologne was very alluring. There was also a trace of familiar smell. Chapter 1825. When she smelled that familiar scent, Yi Liangqiu wanted to struggle, but she was slightly stunned when she smelled that familiar scent. Was it Anlin? All the pores on her body stood up to sense his presence. The bed sunk deep into her, and he sat beside her. She clenched her fists, and her body was a little tense and hot. It had been a long time since they last touched. She was actually nervous and longing for it. She was also a woman. There were many nights when she couldn't sleep because she longed for him. Yes, even though he was burned, she still longed for him. She longed for his appearance and his body. Although it was a little heavy, she didn't want to deny it to herself. A palm was placed on her shoulder. She didn't even dare to breathe. She pursed her lips tightly and felt his presence. She was blindfolded, but her eyes were a little hot, and she wanted to cry. If her hands weren't tied, she would choose to hug him. However, she couldn't. She had to stay calm. Her lips were kissed. His soft lips probed her gently and cautiously. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips tightly, not allowing him to enter easily. However, her cheeks were immediately pinched, and then her lips were firmly sealed. He kissed her deeply, and it was a little rough. Everything about her, from her mind to her body. There was only darkness in front of her, and she couldn't move her hands. She was forced to be kissed. He seemed to have deliberately changed his method so that she wouldn't find out that it was him. The way he kissed her was like a rapist who kidnapped a woman, using a very despicable method. She started to feel uneasy and started to struggle. She was very afraid, and his breath on her neck was like that of a wild beast. No. Her voice was broken, and there was a hint of begging. He didn't stop and stubbornly kissed her. He kissed all of her, but he didn't go any further. She screamed and bit him, but nothing could stop him. There was a hidden scent in the air, with a hint of fishy sweetness. Finally, he leaned against her neck, panting. The skin on one side of her face was smooth. She wanted to touch the remaining half of her face, but she couldn't. She didn't dare to. The man panted for a long time before he propped himself up. His voice was a little hoarse. It doesn't taste good. Nothing much. Yi Liangqiu asked softly, you want to roast me and eat me? Maybe. His voice was so hoarse that she couldn't recognize it, but his eyes seemed to be on fire as he looked at her. A moment later, a trace of pain flashed across his black eyes. He got up and walked to the French window. He looked at the moonlight outside like a trapped beast. I'm just a lonely old man who needs company. He lowered his head and laughed at himself, reaching out to touch his face. Yi Liangqiu just lay there. Her silk pajamas had long been disheveled. Her appearance was breathtakingly beautiful. Suddenly, he remembered that she was still feeding the baby. His Adam's apple bobbed a few times and his voice was deep. Are you in pain? Pain? Yi Liangqiu was at a loss. However, he had already slowly walked over and threw himself onto the ground again. When he got up, he wiped his lower lip and said in an even deeper voice, I'll look for you regularly in the future. Yi Liangqiu felt like fucking hell. What was this? Was he trying to snatch food from An Lan? Moreover, he ate it cleanly, leaving nothing behind. This time, she was really in pain. If she could, she wanted to glare at him. Chapter 1826. He bent down and put his index finger on her lips. Otherwise, I'll eat you up. Don't you think you're a pervert? She couldn't help but kick him. What Wolf of Wall Street? What king? He was just a dead pervert. Did he think that no one could see through such a clumsy trick? Yi Liangqiu sneered. Don't you want to live anymore? He pressed her down and looked at her beautiful face. He looked at her black hair and looked at her beauty. He touched his own face and suddenly realized that the two of them were like a beautiful woman and a wild beast. He could only hide in the dark. She was right. He was a pervert. His dark eyes stared at her face. He wanted to kiss her, but he was timid. He actually didn't dare to touch her. Why? Aren't you going to eat me up? Aren't you going to rape me? She twisted a few times, purposely making herself a bit more lively. She believed that Anlin wouldn't be able to resist. Sure enough, his breathing became hotter and he stared at her as if his eyes were on fire. Although she couldn't see it, she could feel it. Their faces were so close, but in his heart, the distance between them was like the clouds and the mud. Finally, he straightened his body and left her body. His voice was hoarse and cold. I'll get someone to send you away. Why? She asked him. Why did you let me go? He looked at her, the corners of his mouth pressed into a straight line. That half of his face looked even more sinister and terrifying. You're so thirsty for a man. He sneered. Unfortunately, I'm not interested in you. After saying that, he smiled so strangely that it made her hair stand on end. Actually, she was a little worried about whether he was mentally healthy. Could it be that he was bored out of his mind? But she still had to pretend that she didn't know it was him and pretend to be angry. You said you're not interested when you kidnapped me. She sneered. He didn't seem to want to talk to her anymore. He tidied her clothes and put on his coat, buttoning it very tightly. Her hands were temporarily released. At that moment, she really wanted to hug him and not let him go again. But what could she do if she hugged him? He would always find a way to throw her away. With all her might, she held it in. She was taken away. At the scene, the lights were turned on. Chin Anlin was wearing a dark nightgown. The lapel of the nightgown was slightly open, revealing half of his body that was full of scars. And that face, half angel, half devil. But he was still sexy and good-looking. It was just that he didn't notice anything. He casually poured himself a glass of red wine and took a sip, but he couldn't taste it. It was because her body was even sweeter, especially that round and tender delicacy. After drinking it, he wanted more. He couldn't help but smile bitterly as he recalled how she had called him a pervert. He wanted to be a pervert for once, but he couldn't. Chin Anlin, it's enough to do such a despicable thing once. However, he seemed to be addicted. Only in such darkness could he look at her, kiss her, and do whatever he wanted. And when he kissed her, she responded. She had desires. Chin Anlin, she is a normal woman, and you can't give her anything. He raised his hand to look at his watch. It had been 2 hours since he had kidnapped her. He chuckled softly, as desperate as a beast in a tower. How could he love her? He was no longer the Chin Anlin of the past, and she didn't have to be with him. Chapter 1827. When Yi Liangqiu returned to the apartment, Su Xiu was anxious. She said she would be back at 8, but it was already 10:30. An and Lon Lon played for a while. In the end, they had no choice but to soak themselves in milk. But the two little ones obviously didn't enjoy it. Now that Yi Liangqiu came back, they finally heaved a sigh of relief. What happened? Su Xiu's nose was very sensitive. When she got close, she smelled a man's scent. And it was a wild man's, and he even sprayed it with perfume. Young madam had a man. What stage had it developed to? Su Xiu was stunned. Su Xiu was anxious. How could this be? If there was a wild man, what would happen to young master? At first, she was just smelling it and guessing, but later on, she was sure. Yi Liangqiu went to the baby's bedroom. The two babies were asleep, but as soon as he heard footsteps, they both woke up with a cry. They were so hungry. They weren't full at all. Yi Liangqiu couldn't think of it for a moment, so she carried it in. But when she untied herself, she realized that it was too late. Envin didn't eat it and felt wronged. She cried and her voice shook the sky. It was okay to coax the children, but Su Xiu was stunned at the sight. Before she left, she had eaten once. It had been 4 hours. She shouldn't have not slept at all. There was only one possibility, and that was that she was eaten by a wild man. Yes, she must have been eaten by a wild man. Su Xiu's heart was cold. Young master, if you didn't come back, there would be nothing left. At this moment, young madam had probably defected. But Su Xiu couldn't blame Liangqiu. Young master didn't come back, she looked on, then wiped her tears and went back to her room. She cried even more sadly than An. Yi Liangqiu didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She knew what Su Xiu was thinking. She could also smell the scent on her body. 10, the scent of a man. After making the milk and coaxing the two babies, she went to Su Xiu's bedroom. Su Xiu was kneeling, facing the east, and muttering sorry in the direction of the old lady. Yi Liangqiu found it funny and infuriating at the same time, but she also felt sorry for him. Aunt Su was old and didn't know how to get angry. She didn't dare to ask anything and only dared to secretly wipe away her tears. After watching for a while, she slowly walked over. She didn't pull up her sleeves, but half knelt beside her and softly said, "Aunt Sue, I also miss the old lady, but we can't disturb her, right?" She purposely wanted to make Qingshu happy, so she smiled and continued, "Maybe she still wants to find a young man down there. With us crying and making a fuss, she's no longer in the mood." As expected, Crisp Xiao was amused. She looked at her and said unhappily, "Stop messing around. Our old lady is such a loyal person. How could she like young men?" Yi Liangqiu stared at Su Xiao and smiled. "Aunt Sue, I'm the same as old madam. Don't worry." Shu Xiao wiped her tears and looked at her. "You mean?" She shook her head in disbelief. "Young madam, that's not what I meant. You're still young. If you really want to find someone, I won't stop you. It's true. As long as you take good care of the children." Yi Liangqiu helped her up. "Aunt Sue, you've been watching too much of the 8 o'clock show. Look at me, who would like me?" Yi Liangqiu helped her sit down and personally poured a cup of tea for her. Chapter 1828. Crisp Xiao held the tea in her hands, looking rather petty. "Who said that? Look at that Duyuashing. Once you said it, he immediately rushed over from Hong Kong. I don't believe that he doesn't have a secret in his heart. If he has feelings, then I want to be with him." Yi Liangqiu seemed to be coaxing a child. "All these years, I don't believe that no one has liked Aunt Sue. Isn't Aunt Sue living well in the Qin family, watching over old Madam and Anlin? That's different. Aunt Sue is a servant." Crisp Xiao sighed. "And you, supporting such a big family, it's too hard. Then sell Kind Entertainment, it'll be easy." Yi Liangqiu laughed. Crisp Xiao's face turned fierce. "How can that be?" She sighed. "Really, if young madam wants to find someone, Aunt Sue won't stop you." Yi Liangqiu shook her head. "Really, there's no such thing as a man." "How can I believe it?" Crisp Sleeve's eyes reddened, and her old face was also a little red. After a long while, she turned her old face away and coughed lightly. "There's a big finger mark there. And Lon Lon can't even drink it, so it can't be done by a woman, right?" Yi Liangqiu knew it was caused by this and sighed. "If I said it was Anlin, would you believe me, Aunt Sue?" "Anlin?" Qingshu's eyes opened very, very wide, and she was hesitant. She didn't want to say it, but now she had to. Yi Liangqiu told him everything that had happened tonight and gave him some instructions. Crisp Xiao was confused and didn't recover for a long time. What was going on? The young master kidnapped his wife and did something perverted. The worst thing was that he stole his own son's food. Crisp Xiao thought about it and felt that young master was very perverted. She looked at Yi Liangqiu. "Then you're just going to let him take advantage of you for nothing? Is there a way?" Yi Liangqiu sighed. "He's not coming back, and I don't want to force him. This is also good." "What's so good about it? What does Anlin Lon eat?" "If I tie you up for no reason, you're fine, but if young master doesn't get a bunch of bad habits, won't he have a good life in the future?" The more Crispy Sleeve thought about it, the more she felt that her young master was a pervert. She looked at Yi Liangqiu carefully. She was not sure. After all, Mr. Du looked like a gentleman. Now that the young master's face was bad and he was so perverted, what if the young madam hated him? But she thought that it was better to not be able to see. Didn't they say that being hung up without being able to see or eat was the most uncomfortable thing? Thinking about it, although it was perverted, it was still quite brilliant. Soft Sleeve tried to think positively, but she still felt that it was very perverted. "Thank you for your hard work, young mistress." Yi Liangqiu only returned to her bedroom after Su Xiu's emotions had stabilized. He took off his jacket and found that it was still the pajamas that did not belong to him. She sniffed it. It was filled with the scent of a man, mixed with cologne and light alcohol. It was no wonder that Crispy Sleeve was suspicious from the start. Thinking about that look, it was funny. The pajamas fell to the ground. She looked at herself in the mirror. Just as Crispy Sleeve said, there were finger marks on her body, left by him uncontrollably. She was still beautiful. He should like it, right? A bitter smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. "Yi Liangqiu, I didn't expect that one day, you would also reach this stage, needing to use your body to keep him." Chapter 1829. But she also didn't know why he didn't kill her tonight. Clearly, his eyes were moving. She washed her body and smeared medicine on the finger marks. The children wanted to eat it, so she felt a little ashamed to see it herself. After the shower, she went back to the bedroom and lay down. When she closed her eyes, she thought of the scene in the dark. She couldn't sleep. For the first time, she felt that Qin Anlin was so hateful. Du Yuexing arrived at noon, and Kaim was there to pick her up. Yi Liangqiu booked a restaurant first and had lunch with Du Yuexing. After lunch, Kaim left first, leaving the two of them in the private room of the restaurant. Du Yuexing sat on the sofa and watched indifferently as Yi Liangqiu poured tea. She was very obedient in front of him, as if she was treating her benefactor. To be honest, he liked it very much. He liked how confident she was when she first came to him. At that time, she said that she could agree to all his conditions. Actually, his only condition was herself. But this little liar, after using her, she just left like that. When Qin Anlin came to find him, he could have refused, because at that time, he was angry at her. But in the end, he still agreed because he couldn't bear to part with her. He had seen her cry her heart out for Qin Anlin. At that time, he thought that he should give up. There was no room for anyone else in her heart. But then, her calmness made him feel that he didn't know her very well. She seemed to calm down very quickly. Maybe, he still had a chance. He was willing to stay in B City and work like a slave. When he was done, he found that He narrowed his eyes. It was another trap. The obsession in her heart was still Qin Anlin. When the maple forest was planted and the whole of B City was covered in red, he gave up and went back to Hong Kong. However, as soon as she called him, he came back again and was used by her like a slave. She was using him openly and above board. She would offer him some benefits outside of their relationship. She thought that she wouldn't owe him. He wanted her to owe him so much that she couldn't repay him. Actually, there were so many beautiful women waiting for him to love, like, and admire, but he still couldn't let go of her. Maybe it was because what he couldn't get would always be there. Or maybe she was too much like someone. That person was gone, but Yi Liangqiu was still alive in front of him. Du Yuexing looked at her. "I heard that King is Anlin." As she poured the tea, she lowered her head and said, "It's him." "Any plans?" he asked calmly. "Do you think you can force him out with a banquet?" If it was that simple, he wouldn't be called Qin Anlin, and he wouldn't be able to stir up such a storm on Wall Street. Moreover, Qin Anlin was very smart. He knew that he couldn't hide it, so he didn't completely live in seclusion. Instead, he chose to strengthen his own power. This way, she couldn't do anything to him for the time being. Moreover, Qin Anlin was smart. He knew that he couldn't hide it, so he didn't go into seclusion. Instead, he chose to strengthen his power. She couldn't do anything to him. He thought that the person who could touch Yi Liangqiu's heart must be the secretary, Zhang Yuanyuan. No, but I don't think he can be indifferent. At least before he does anything, he will think about whether I will go overboard. Her little face was tense. Du Yueshing thought that she was cute but also hateful. Because she cared for Qi Nanlin. And he had taken in 2 young girls in Hong Kong, but he didn't see any movement from her. Chapter 1830. He picked up the tea and sniffed it. There was a trace of her fragrance on it. After a pause, he took a sip and said indifferently, "It's just a photo. It's nothing. Why bother? I care." It was rare for her to be so unreasonable. He looked at her as if he was looking at the old Yi Liangqiu. She was also the same unreasonable person who asked him to buy her shares and work for her. Du Yueshing looked at her and paused for a moment. After a while, he smiled. "Does he know that you care so much? If he doesn't come, won't everything be in vain?" "He won't come, but I think he will know." Yi Liangqiu snorted coldly. "I don't believe that he cares." When she said this, she looked like a little girl, which was quite vivid. Du Yueshing looked at her for a long time and secretly sighed in his heart. After all, she was not that person. That person did not have such a side. There was a nostalgic look on his face. After looking at her for a long time, he smiled faintly. "Liangqiu, I suddenly feel that I am old." She looked at him for a long time and slowly said, "You are indeed old." She was in her early 40s. Wasn't that old? Du Yueshing stared at her. He felt that all his calmness had disappeared. However, looking at her faint smile, he guessed that she should know in her heart. What a love-hate girl. Yes, he was old, and she was younger than him by more than 10 years. His pursuit of her was like an old cow eating young grass, the kind that he could not eat. But he was still willing to be with her, so he faintly looked at her face and felt very comfortable. The little regret in his life seemed to have been filled up. This naughty girl obviously knew what he was thinking, but she pretended not to know. She did not expose him, so he could only continue to play dumb. Perhaps, he was waiting for her to give up on Qi Nanlin. People were like that. If she gave up, she probably would not fall in love with someone more than 10 years older than her. But he thought that even if it was because of other reasons, as long as she was willing to be with him, he would be very satisfied. Du Yueshing knew that he liked Yi Liangqiu, but if it was love, he wasn't sure if it could be considered love. He wasn't young anymore. It was rare for him to meet a woman he liked, so he didn't want to keep looking. He took a sip of tea and smiled. Sometimes, age doesn't determine one's age. There was a strong hint in his words, and it was impossible for Yi Liangqiu not to understand. However, she could only pretend that she didn't understand. It wasn't suitable for them to talk about such matters when they were alone. Seeing that she was silent, Du Yueshing smiled. "How do you want me to help you?" Yi Liangqiu said slowly, "Tonight, we will announce our engagement." Du Yueshing nearly lost her composure as she nearly spat out a mouthful of tea. He looked at her and said slowly, "Can a fiancé enjoy the rights he has?" There was a spark in his eyes, and the way he looked at her was a little fervent. Yi Liangqiu dodged him and coughed lightly. "A kiss on the cheek should work." Du Yueshing sneered. "A kiss on the cheek and I have to carry the identity of a married man. Yi Liangqiu, no matter how you look at it, this deal doesn't seem worth it. Moreover, I have to face retaliation at any time. What if you add in the management rights of King Entertainment?" She smiled and looked at him. Chapter 1831. Du Yueshing's eyes darkened as he stared at her deeply. After a long time, he smiled faintly and said, "Mr. Yi has a good idea." She wanted to chase a man and leave the company to him. After that, she could come back and take it. How could he not give it to her? If it were someone else, he would have agreed. But this person was Yi Liangqiu, however, he couldn't reject her. It wasn't because of King Entertainment, but because she said that he could kiss her face. Then he would just kiss her face properly. Also, lips seemed to grow on her face, Du Yuexing thought immorally. If he kissed her, he wondered what Qin Anlan would think when he saw it. Would he be jealous? He looked at her gently. He thought that if Qin Anlan backed down, he wouldn't give up. He would hold Liangqiu's hand tightly and tell her that he wanted her. When Yi Liangqiu left, Du Yuexing sent her all the way to the hotel. When she got into the car, she turned around and looked at him deeply. Mr. Du, you must have loved someone before. He didn't say anything. Yi Liangqiu looked down and smiled faintly. Mr. Du, you haven't forgotten about it yet, have you? His body trembled and he knew what she meant. She was indeed the woman Qin Anlan liked. She was too smart and nothing could be hidden from her. With a hoarse voice, he reached out and touched her hair. You and her are actually different. No one was a substitute. In his eyes, she was still Yi Liangqiu. If they looked alike, then he could find a woman who looked more like her. The reason he was interested in her was probably because of her character. It was pretty good. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly and didn't say anything else. She got into the car and said goodbye to him. Du Yuexing smiled back and told her that he would see her tonight. But his eyes flashed and he changed his mind. He leaned over and kissed her cheek quickly. Before she could resist, he whispered, "You were the one who said that I could kiss her face." He only kissed her once before straightening up. Yi Liangqiu reached out to touch her face, feeling a little stunned. Get used to it. Otherwise, I won't be able to convince others. Du Yuexing returned to his gentlemanly appearance. He had always been polite in front of her. As for the accident just now, she also hoped that it was as he said. Yi Liangqiu smiled and slowly drove the car away. When she returned to the apartment, the styling team had already arrived with the latest items of the season. There were more than 10 dresses for her to choose from. Of course, each dress came with matching jewelry, shoes, and bags. Yi Liangqiu took a shower and dried her hair. She felt refreshed and comfortable. His fingers shuttled back and forth between the dresses, and he quickly chose a Dior Starry Sky dress. Miss Ye's taste is really good. Many socialites and celebrities like this dress very much. The designer smiled and took the dress down. Yi Liangqiu changed and walked slowly to the mirror. The starry sky of the dress was a gradual change. It was supported by 2 very thin shoulder straps. It was very demanding on the figure. The whole dress looked very ethereal, like a little fairy. It also made her look a lot younger. Especially with her long hair tied behind her head, she looked very gentle. This dress is the most suitable for Miss Yi. The stylist couldn't help but exclaim as he helped her put on the water droplet-shaped earrings. Yi Liangqiu smiled slightly. Really? She looked at herself and felt a little incredulous. She had given birth to 5 children, yet her waist was so thin. Of course, a certain part of her body was much fuller. Apart from being ethereal, she also looked a little more seductive. Chapter 1832. The banquet was held at the New York branch of the GM Hotel. Tang Yu and Pei Qiqi were also in New York recently, so they attended the banquet with Xiaoxin. Yi Muyun lived with the Tang family, so he came with them. As soon as he got out of the car, he attracted a lot of reporters. Boyi was a multinational company, ranked in the top 50 in the world. Every move of the president of Boyi was eye-catching, especially since he had no children. Bringing Yi Muyun with him was even more significant. Tang Yu held Pei Qiqi's hand, and next to him was his beloved daughter, Tang Sher. On the other side stood the 10-year-old Yi Muyun. He was so young, but he was terrifyingly calm. The reporters frantically asked questions about Yi Muyun's status in the Tang family. One had to know that helping someone raise a child was usually related by marriage. President Tang only had one daughter. Many people guessed that he would be Tang Sher's husband in the future. Faced with the questions, Tang Yut smiled slightly. Mu Yun is President Qin's eldest son, and of course, he is also my favorite successor. His words were like a balm. After all, a son-in-law and a successor were two completely different identities. The latter, on the other hand, would only marry Tang Shui, or after being given the highest authority. She would never be an accessory of the Tang family. Mr. Tang, do you have such high hopes for President Qin's child? What if, before she could ask further, Tang Yu smiled and placed his big palm on Yi Muyun's little head. There won't be any what if. The child raised by me, Tang Yu, will not be bad. His words were naturally authoritative, and no one dared to refute him. However, Xiaoxin's eyes were filled with tears. It was so scary. She had to be with the little brother cannibal every day. She heard that she could marry the little brother cannibal when she grew up. She did not know why her papa agreed. Anyway, the little brother cannibal had already lived in her house. Sometimes when she stayed in her papa's bed, her papa would directly carry her to the little brother cannibal's bed. She didn't want to. It was so scary. On the first night she slept with the little cannibal big bro, it was as if he was hugging a doll. When she slept, she could not move at all. If she moved even a little, he would trap her and stare at her like he wanted to eat her alive. She watched the whole night, not daring to cry, not daring to call for her mother. Because her mother was not free, she was bullied by her father. Xiaoxin was as pitiful as Mummy. Would Xiaoxin also be eaten by little older brother? Mummy would cry miserably every time, saying that she did not want it anymore and that it was painful. My heart is afraid of pain. Wah, wah, wah. Little big brother cannibal did not eat her. He only stared at her for the whole night. The next morning, he seemed especially happy. He cupped her little face and kissed her. It was soft and gentle, and quite comfortable. She gathered her courage and asked him if he would eat her little heart. She even threatened him, saying that he would eat her up. There was no one else in the world with such a cute heart. The little brother rubbed her long hair and said that he would eat her when she grew up. He's so bad. But it was safe for the time being. After that, he would sneak into her room every night. Most of the time, he would carry her to his bedroom and hug her to sleep. However, he did not eat her again. At most, he would bite her little face and say that it smelled good. Xiaoxin was not fragrant. If it smelled good, she would be eaten. At this moment, she secretly looked at little older brother. He had a straight face and looked quite similar to her papa. Chapter 1833. At this moment, she sneaked a peek at her little older brother. He had a straight face and looked quite similar to her father. Then they would probably eat people too. Thinking about how her mother said it hurt, Xiaoxin took another look at Yi Muyun. She pouted her little mouth and looked pitiful. Tang Yu calmly brought his wife, daughter, and other people's children into the banquet hall. Pei Chi wasn't dressed formally tonight. She wore a black knee-length dress that Mr. Tang picked out. He said that the color of her dress reminded him of the first time she bumped into him in his room. How could Pei Chi not know what he was thinking? She smiled slightly and didn't accept the interview. It was Tang Yu's decision about Mu Yun, so she felt that Xiaoxin was a little afraid of Mu Yun. Mu Yun combined Anlin and Liangqiu, but instead became Tang Yu. It would be strange if Xiaoxin wasn't afraid. As soon as they entered, Yi Liangqiu came up to them. Yi Muyun went up to her and hugged her. "Mommy, happy birthday." As he spoke, he took out a gift. It was the first money he earned under Uncle Tang's guidance to buy a pair of earrings. Yi Liangqiu was quite surprised and kissed him. Yi Muyun was a 10-year-old child after all. His little face was a little red when he was praised. When he looked up, he saw Xiaoxin looking at the gift eagerly. He whispered, "Next time, I'll buy it for you." He looked at the little dress she was wearing and thought that he should buy it for her. In the future, she should wear and use the money he earned to buy it. In Uncle Tang's house, not only did he have to earn his own expenses, but he also had to pay for Xiaoxin's life. Of course, he didn't have to use his mother's money, but he earned it himself. Xiaoxin looked at him and softly said, "Xiaoxin, don't." Her voice was crisp and delicate. But Yi Muyun thought, how could she be so cute? Even a milky yellow bun had emotions. He smiled indulgently, treating her rejection as nothing. He was too strong, and she was too weak. In the following 10 years, she slowly succumbed to him. What she wore, what she used, what she ate, it was all up to him. He had become her boyfriend, or rather, he was the one who had raised her. Fortunately, he was very busy. Xiaoxin felt that the days he was not at home were like a prisoner on a break. Looking at the pair of children playing around, the adults all laughed. "What are you guys talking about?" a male voice asked. Yi Liangqiu looked up and saw Du Yuexing walking over. She smiled and said, "We're chatting." "Yuexing, let me introduce you." Tang Yu and Pei Qiqi looked at each other. "Yuexing. When did they become so close?" Did this mean that there was nothing for Qin Anlin to do? While he was deep in thought, Du Yuexing had already walked over and extended her hand with a smile. "Mr. Tang, it's an honor to meet you. I often hear Liangqiu mention you." Tang Yu also smiled faintly. "It's Liangqiu who thinks too highly of me." He had no intention of introducing Qiqi to this person. There was no need for it. Pei Qiqi was also not interested. She just watched from the side. She was thinking, where did Anlin go? His wife was openly going out with someone else, so where was he hiding? He was really calm. Could he forget Liangqiu just because he was with his beautiful secretary? Of course, she didn't believe it. If Anlin could let it go, he would have let it go long ago. Why would he wait until now? But after walking around, there was no one. Chapter 1834. However, she didn't see him after circling around. But that might not be the case. There would be a masquerade ball later, and perhaps he would appear. An arm hooked around her, and then she heard a deep voice. "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking about Anlin," Pei Qiqi said openly, and then her lips were sealed. It was just a light kiss, but she could feel how exasperated Mr. Tang was. Sigh, Anlin already had a few tricks up his sleeves, and he still cared about this. "Don't think about anyone else in the future." Tang Yu's voice was low and hoarse. "I'll teach you a lesson when we get back." Pei Qiqi hugged his waist and smiled. "I'm going to be taught a lesson anyway. I'll think about it a little more." Tang Yu was furious. She was really becoming less and less afraid of him. She was so shameless. He calmly picked up the wine beside him, took a sip, and looked at her. "It seems that you're not afraid anymore." His dark eyes were filled with a deep jade-like gaze that only she could see. Pei Qiqi immediately put away her fake smile. "I'm scared, very scared." He snorted, determined to teach her a lesson tonight. But at this moment, his attention was on the stage. "I heard that Liangqiu will announce her engagement with that old man Du Yuexing tonight." Pei Qiqi stared at him. "You don't seem to be much younger than him." "Pei Qiqi, your husband is 35, the best age in a man's life," he emphasized. After a pause, he said, Anlin will come. Pei Chi wasn't so optimistic and shook her head. There was no host for tonight's banquet, and it was a buffet French meal. And Du Yuexing and Yi Liangqiu had been together the whole time, so it could be considered as an announcement of their relationship. Everyone was guessing, so it wasn't strange. Du Yuexing had been by Yi Liangqiu's side for a long time in B City. At 10 o'clock, the masquerade ball began. Before Du Yuexing put on his mask, he hugged and kissed Yi Liangqiu. He did not kiss her face as she had said. Instead, he hugged her in his arms and gently kissed her lips. Although it was not deep enough, it was enough for Xiaohun. No one would suspect that they were just putting on a show. Du Yuexing's expression was very engrossed. He was a man who was completely immersed in love. Yi Liangqiu was stunned. He then pressed his lips against hers and whispered, "Close your eyes. If you don't want to arouse suspicion." She closed her eyes in a panic. In fact, she felt a little regretful. She should not have provoked Du Yuexing. He was much more serious than she thought. Du Yuexing chuckled softly. You shouldn't have provoked her, but you have already provoked her. Liangqiu, you can't escape. He returned to the hotel and thought for a long time. In the end, he decided not to let go of this opportunity. It didn't matter if it was real or fake. He wanted to make their relationship real. He had taken advantage of the situation. It was a little despicable, but emotions were selfish, weren't they? Qin Anlin, he could only say sorry. Such a kiss lasted for a very, very long time. Because he did not allow her to escape, the seemingly gentle kiss was actually domineering. His hand pressed against her back, not letting her move unless she wanted to tell everyone that they were putting on a show. And he knew the critical point where she would not fall out with him. In the crowd, among the masks, a black shadow stood there, his eyes deep and serene. His slender figure was set off by the fitted suit, making him look particularly tall and straight. He looked at her just like that, his heart aching. He looked at his Liangqiu kissing someone else. Was she very happy now? Chapter 1835. After the kiss, Yi Liangqiu pushed Du Yuexing away without batting an eyelid. Gritting her teeth, she said, Mr. Du, that's not what I said previously. Oh, I got carried away. I'm sorry. It was rare for Du Yuexing to be so shameless. He looked around and smiled. Also, I think you should call me Yuexing. Otherwise, I'm afraid of being suspected. Yi Liangqiu glared at him. He couldn't help but laugh. Reaching out, he gently pinched her cheek. Liangqiu, you'll really be suspected if you do this. With that said, he bent down and planted a light kiss on her lips. He murmured, we can dance now. He helped her put on the mask and led her off the stage. As he walked, he said, do you regret your decision? I forgot to tell you that there's always a price to pay for everything. It's the same tonight. Yi Liangqiu finally came back to her senses. Gritting her teeth, she said, Du Yuexing, don't you think it's too much? Compared to what you did to me, I don't think so. He smiled faintly and looked sideways at her. Liangqiu, the mask you're wearing is very interesting. She reached out to touch it but couldn't feel anything. Du Yuexing kindly reminded her, it's a pretty girl warrior. Pretty girl warrior. Yi Liangqiu's eyes were filled with anger. Luckily, it was blocked by the mask. Du Yuexing wore an elegant mask and bent down. It's specially prepared for you. I think it suits you. She wanted to take it off, but if she did so now, she would lose her composure. The dance continued. She was in the crook of his arm. Unexpectedly, Du Yuexing danced very well. She managed to hold the stage. But even so, she wouldn't forgive his impetuousness today. After the song ended, he stopped and her body froze as well. The surrounding noise seemed to be calm. The world was so quiet that it seemed like there were only the two of them. Behind the mask, his gaze was deep. Liangqiu, I'm serious. Her gaze paused and looked straight at him, stunned. If one day, you change your mind, I will be here, waiting for you. His voice had the sensuality of a 40-year-old man, and she wanted to escape. However, he obviously didn't want to scare her. He smiled lightly and said, if you haven't given up on Anlin, I can accompany you. In any case, he had never met a girl who was more tempted than her. Before Yi Liangqiu could refuse, her waist was wrapped by a strong arm, then, she bumped into a sturdy body, and her face was buried in a masculine embrace. Fortunately, she had a mask to block it, otherwise, it would have been very painful. She was in a daze for a long time. When she looked up, she saw a cold mask. Unlike the others, this was a complete silver mask. It was suffused with a cold and gloomy light, and the pair of eyes also seemed to be flickering with a cold light. The heat of his hand burned her, and she looked down to see that he was wearing gloves. Her lips trembled slightly. She restrained herself because she knew that he was Anlin. He came. Only by wearing masks could they see each other under the bright lights. Their eyes met, and neither of them looked away. Not far away, Du Yuexing smiled faintly and walked to the side. He could also see that it was Qin Anlin. The masked Qin Anlin. He bet that Yi Liangqiu wouldn't dare to take off the mask. If she forced it, it would only force Qin Anlin away. Chapter 1836. He wasn't young anymore, but for some reason, he seemed to be unable to let go of women when he was younger. This wasn't a good thing. On the contrary, it was very dangerous. On the other side, Yi Liangqiu reached out and held Qin Anlin's shoulder after recovering from her shock. She said in a low voice, "Let's dance." He didn't move for a moment. Then, she boldly hugged his waist and rested her face on his shoulder. He was about to reprimand her, but the music that was playing was very touching and suitable for such a dance. The people around them were also doing the same and would only be more touching than them. Qin Anlin's Adam's apple moved as he lowered his head to look at the woman in his arms. He suddenly reached out and took off her mask. Her beautiful face wasn't obstructed at all. He wanted to see her. His trembling hands moved from the back of her head all the way to the front, cupping her face and not moving away. Then, he moved his hands to the back of her head and pressed her face against his chest. He hugged her tightly like that. Yi Liangqiu's face was pressed against his chest. His heart was beating very fast and he felt very hot. She could still feel the warmth of his body through the few layers of clothing. Did he think that she wouldn't know it was him just like that? She wanted to speak, but he pressed her down and said in a suppressed voice, "Don't move. Otherwise, everything will end." Her body stiffened and she immediately understood what he meant. Or rather, he had admitted his identity, but he wasn't willing to come back. Anlin. Her face was pressed against his chest, and her little hand sneaked under his jacket. She murmured, "You really don't care." He looked down at her, and she also looked up. After so many days, this was the first time they were hugging so openly. His gaze was deep and he didn't answer her. Instead, he lowered his head and kissed her lips. Through the mask, he felt a sense of security. He kissed her deeply, as though there was no one else around. He dared to do what Du Yuexing didn't dare to do. Du Yuexing's light kiss was nothing compared to this kiss. This kiss seemed to be filled with anger as he ruthlessly brushed her lips. Rather than saying it was a kiss, it was more like a punishment. She did not resist and weakly allowed him to kiss her. When he left her lips, she was standing on her tiptoes. Her body was folded in his arms, and her eyes were blurred. He was still wearing the mask, and his voice was hoarse. Happy birthday. He took out a small and exquisite box from his pocket. There was a necklace inside. It was a very beautiful diamond. But, not the ring. She looked at him and lifted her eyes. Stay. There was a trace of coldness in his eyes. He gently broke free from her, turned around, and walked straight out. The crowd was in an uproar. Everyone had guessed that it was Qin Anlin. Because only Qin Anlin's eyes could be so affectionate. He walked away, and she stood there, with 2 long rows of people on either side of her. She stood there and said softly, "Du Yuexing, will you marry me?" Qin Anlin's body paused, but he didn't turn around. He just stood there. When Du Yuexing heard this, she sighed inwardly. If she was smart, she would have rejected it. However, such a request was too tempting, and he couldn't bear to reject it. He smiled faintly. Of course I'm willing. If today is a wedding, I won't reject it. Chapter 1837. Unknowingly, Du Yuexing had come to her side and used his last shred of conscience. Are you serious? We are people of status, we can't afford to lose face like this. Yi Liangqiu raised her face and chuckled. I'm not joking with you, I'm serious. Du Yuexing's expression became serious, and he looked at Yi Liangqiu. Really? Yi Liangqiu didn't make a sound, her eyes gazed at the slender figure in the distance. Finally, he walked forward without looking back, nor did he ask her to stay. She knew that she was being willful, but she had just given birth, and today was her birthday, so she was willing to be willful for once. Yes, I'm serious. With that, she hugged Du Yuexing and kissed his lips. There was a hint of anger, and she was throwing caution to the wind, but she didn't get him to turn back even though she had gambled everything. The scene came to an end because of the male lead's departure. However, Qin Anlin didn't really leave, as Tang Yu got someone to stop him. The waiter was very polite. Mr. Qin, President Tang invites you to a gathering. Qin Anlin turned his head, and there was a cold glint on his mask, which made the waiter's heart sink. However, Qin Anlin followed him to a suite on the 5th floor. The door opened, and the waiter left first. Qin Anlin walked in slowly, passed through the porch, and walked into the luxurious hall. Tang Yu was sitting on the sofa, with 2 goblets and a bottle of red wine in front of him. Anlin, long time no see. Tang Yu smiled and moved his chin. Sit. Qin Anlin didn't move, but looked inside. Chi-Chi is in the bedroom and Xiaoxin and Mu Yun are in a room alone. Tang Yu's voice was indifferent. You haven't been around these days, so I have to tell you. At this point, Tang Yu poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one to Qin Anlin, who was sitting down. He raised his eyebrows slightly. Is it convenient to drink with a mask on? Qin Anlin glanced at him and didn't say anything. Tang Yu smiled. Mu Yun is much stronger than you. He asked to be Boyi's successor. Also, he wants to marry Xiaoxin when he grows up. Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes. You agreed. Are you asking about the successor or about Xiaoxin? Tang Yu looked into his eyes, as if he could see into them. Qin Anlin was a little embarrassed. Both. Tang Yu's body fell backwards, a charming smile on his handsome face. I promised to give him a chance. As for being careful, she has to be willing. Qin Anlin closed his eyes. Although Tang Yu said it lightly, he could imagine how difficult it was for Mu Yun. Anlin, think about it. Do you really want to see Liangqiu and Du Yuexing together? Tang Yu's tone was even more indifferent. She's not joking. You should know her temper. Qin Anlin smiled bitterly. Yes, of course he knew that she was angry. He was alive, and he asked someone to tell her that he was dead. She had been sad for so long and gave birth to a child alone, but he still refused to come out. Now that they had met, he still refused to acknowledge her. Qin Anlin wiped his face, but it was cold. He let out a long sigh. What can I do to get her back? With that, he took off the mask. Do I have such a face? Tang Yu was a little stunned, not because of the face, but because of Anlin's emotions. The same body. Qin Anlin's face was inscrutable. He reached out to take off his coat and shirt. Chapter 1838. Tang Yu was in a daze, forgetting to drink the wine that he was holding in his hand. They heard a scream from the bedroom door. They turned to take a look and saw that it was Pei Chi-Chi. Pei Chi-Chi was wearing a cute bear pajamas. Mr. Tang had requested for it, saying that there would be a special event that night. She did not expect Anlin to be here, nor did she expect Anlin to take off his clothes here. She swallowed her saliva and jumped over. Wow! What great skin! These injuries are so charming. So sexy. Pei Chi-Chi reached out and touched Qin Anlin's injury. Anlin, how can this injury be so ugly? She looked like she was about to drool, especially when she was swaying her body and wagging her short tail. She looked really cute. Qin Anlin looked at her and then at Tang Yu. He was originally feeling rather gloomy, but now, he felt like fucking hell. This couple had been married for so many years, yet they were still fooling around. And Pei Chi-Chi didn't look scared when she saw his injury. It didn't seem like she was pretending. Was it really sexy? He was a little confused and looked at her. His voice was a little hoarse. Chi-Chi, don't touch it. Pei Chi-Chi looked like she couldn't bear to let go of it. It's quite nice. She looked up and looked at him eagerly. Anlin, do you know that it's very precious? It makes people want to touch it. She didn't look like she was pretending at all. She continued to drool. If you were like this in the past, there wouldn't be a chance for Tang Yu. Tang Yu narrowed his eyes and glared at her. His voice was a little creepy. Pei Chi-Chi. Pei Chi-Chi stuck out her tongue. Oh, I'll go back to my room and wait for you. She deliberately used a voice that Qin Anlin could hear. The big bad wolf's pajamas are ready for you. Hurry up. Qin Anlin felt that he simply couldn't bear to listen anymore. This couple, seriously, Tang Yu was also a little embarrassed. He coughed lightly. Go back to your room. Only then did Pei Chi-Chi reluctantly leave. Before she left, she even caressed Qin Anlin one more time. Qin Anlin adjusted his clothes and was even more annoyed. How did you raise her into such a sweet and innocent girl? In the past, she was quite a lonely girl. Although she got a little cramp later, she shouldn't be like this. Tang Yu smiled faintly and narrowed his eyes. Just spoil her. He got up. Don't wait until you regret it. She reached out and patted him. Look, even Chi-Chi admires your injuries. Liang Qiu should like them too. The corners of Qin Anlin's eyes twitched when he saw Tang Yu walk into the bedroom in a hurry. His taste was getting worse. When he returned to his room, he slowly took off the mask and looked at his face in the mirror. It was still so scary. When Chi-Chi saw it, she said it had character. If Liang Qiu saw it, would she be afraid? He didn't dare to take the risk. Moreover, he couldn't give her anything. Even when Du Yuexing kissed her today, he didn't stop him. For the first time, he was so weak because he couldn't give her everything. He walked into the bathroom. The water washed over his body and those ugly scars. GM Hotel. Linda sent Du Yuexing back to the suite. She helped him in because Mr. Du was drunk. Du Yuexing was drunk because of Yi Liangqiu. She was unhappy and pulled Du Yuexing to drink. Chapter 1839. She helped Du Yuesheng lie on the sofa while Linda went to get him some water. There was a glass of water on the table. She took a sip and gave it to Du Yuesheng without thinking too much. She helped him and carefully fed him a few mouthfuls. "Mr. Du, how is it?" Linda took good care of him, mainly because Mr. Du might be her boss in the future. She had seen the situation clearly. If President Qin did not return, Mr. Du would most likely marry Mr. Yi. From then on, she would have to follow Mr. Du's instructions. Linda was not stupid. She was now Mr. Ye's confidant. She was treated well in all aspects. If she wanted to survive, she would have to look at the situation. It was rare for Du Yuesheng to get drunk. At this moment, he was bent in a woman's embrace. He could smell a fragrance. It was a feeling he had not felt for a long time. In his private life, he did not control himself too much. After all, he was single. He liked Liangqiu, but she did not really get together with him. Hence, he had always had a woman in Hong Kong and had never been chased. Women were not rare to him. But now that he was drunk and uncomfortable, it felt different to have a pair of gentle hands supporting him. Du Yuesheng opened his drunken eyes and looked at the little face in front of him. He was too drunk and could not tell who she was, but he hoped that she was Liangqiu. He closed his eyes and grabbed her hand. "Liangqiu." Linda was shocked and widened her eyes. "Mr. Du." "I'm Linda." "Mr. Du." This voice was very unfamiliar. It was not Liangqiu. Linda was Liangqiu's secretary. He remembered that she was quite pretty. Du Yuesheng closed his eyes and let go of Linda. He muttered, "Why is it so hot? Pour me some water." Linda nodded and brought the water to his lips. "Mr. Du, drink some water." Du Yuesheng was so drunk that he had forgotten that the water was poured by him. There was a pill in it. He had thought that if Liangqiu came over tonight, she would drink the water. Then, he would end this complicated relationship. He wanted to marry her. However, he was drunk and forgot that the water was drugged. When he drank it himself, he was fine after a few mouthfuls, but now he had swallowed it all. It was getting hotter and hotter until it was almost unbearable. Du Yuesheng narrowed his eyes before suddenly opening them. He looked at the beautiful face in front of him. That drug made people lose their humanity. It didn't matter if it was Liangqiu or not. At this moment, what he wanted was freedom. The girl in front of him was very beautiful. He pressed her into his arms. Linda was frightened and swallowed hard. "Mr. Du, I am not Mr. Yi." Before she could finish her sentence, she was already kissed. The man's scorching aura immediately engulfed all of her senses. She had never experienced this kind of feeling before. Linda opened her eyes wide and resisted with all her might. No, no, the one who was going to sleep with her now, or rather, the one she was going to sleep with soon, was Mr. Ye's man. "I can't." She hammered and pushed him away with her tiny hands, but she was unable to push him away. On the contrary, as he kissed her, her body gradually heated up, and a deep desire arose within her. Before Du Yuesheng took her, he had a moment of clarity. But at this moment, the woman in his arms was already tender and tender. As a man, and a drunk man at that, he couldn't bear it. Linda was extremely afraid. She bit her lips and cried, "No, I'm afraid of pain." She had never been touched like this before. She was afraid. He looked so scary, from his eyes to his body. Chapter 1840. However, how could she resist a man who had drunk the drug? The drunkenness turned into a muffled moan of warm panting that didn't stop for a long time. All these years, Du Yuesheng was used to seeing romance. A mere Linda was not enough to make him panic. However, it was a little troublesome because Linda was Liang Qiu's person. If he touched her, there had to be an explanation. After the indulgence, all reason returned. Du Yuexing took a shower in the bathroom. Besides washing his body, he also cleared his head. Back in the bedroom, the girl who looked like a flower was sleeping soundly. Her fair body was pressed against the blanket, and on the white bed sheets, there was a dark red bloodstain. He really did not expect that it would be her first time. She looked to be in her mid-20s. Du Yuexing's head hurt. A woman's first time was usually not easy to get rid of. He frowned and narrowed his eyes. Then, he walked to the wine cabinet and poured himself a glass of red wine. He had no intention of sleeping. He just stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window and looked at the night sky outside. In the end, he was waiting for the person on the bed to wake up. When Linda woke up, it was 7 in the morning. The presidential suite of the GM Hotel had a good view. From here, she could see half of New York. In the early morning, there was a thin layer of fog outside, and the scenery was beautiful. She slept on her stomach for the whole night. Moving a little, her body was very sore, and she unconsciously let out a soft cry. When she cried out like that, Du Yuexing knew that she was awake. He turned to look at Linda and said with a hoarse voice unique to men, "You're awake." Linda grunted and then buried her face in the pillow. She really should have pretended. For example, she should have pulled at the bed sheets and shouted, "Where is this? Why is she in his bed?" Then, she should have cried and asked him to take responsibility. However, Linda disdained to do so. This man liked Mr. Yi. That glass of water last night was probably prepared for Mr. Yi. She did not expect that he would lose his integrity in his old age and be taken by a little secretary like her. What a pity. As Linda thought about it, she buried herself in the blanket and smiled. Then, she raised her eyes and looked at the old man. "Mr. Du, you didn't sleep all night. Are you thinking about how to marry me?" Du Yuexing's eyes darkened as she put down the cup in her hand. Her expression was gentle and her voice was even gentler. "Linda, you have a much better sense of humor than Liang Qiu." The two words Liang Qiu, he said it so passionately that Linda couldn't mistake it for someone else. She smiled as well. "If not, then you must be thinking about how many checks you can use to get rid of me." Du Yuexing smiled faintly, her expression becoming more and more affectionate. That expression gave Linda goosebumps. She stammered, "Could it be that he's asleep? He doesn't even have a check." She boldly said, "If that's the case, you'll have to bear the consequences." Du Yuexing grunted as traces of a smile appeared on her lips. "You're going to sue me?" "No." Linda looked at him and mouthed silently, "I'm pregnant." Those few words made Du Yuexing, who had always been shrewd and ruthless, almost jump. He narrowed his eyes. "I don't believe that a girl would dare to do this to herself. Be good, be obedient." Linda was usually very gentle, but her temperament was not that of a little sheep. She couldn't sleep with him for nothing. Furthermore, he had taken medicine. It was her first time. Chapter 1841. The drug wasn't strong and he was an experienced man. He knew how not to hurt a woman. "Rude or not, I can't sleep with you for nothing." Linda sat up and looked at him with her head tilted. "How about I ask Mr. Yi for a check when I'm pregnant?" Du Yuexing had a headache when he heard that. He didn't care about the check, but it wasn't safe for a woman he had slept with to be with Liang Qiu. He pondered for a moment and looked at the girl on the bed. "I'll give you 10 million to leave New York." "Of course." Linda smiled. "If only you had been this straightforward earlier." "Old man." Du Yuexing's eyebrows twitched. He thought to himself that he was older than her, so he didn't mind. He went to the study and came back a minute later. He put a check in her hand and said with the gentleness of an old man, "Be a good girl and remember to take the medicine." She was actually quite sensible. Otherwise, he might not have remembered it in the morning. Most of his female companions were in brothels. Which one of them didn't deal with the aftermath obediently? Linda looked down. 10 million, right? She accepted it with a smile. After putting on her clothes and shoes, she said with a smile, "I forgot to tell you, Mr. Yeet is going back to City B in a month, so he asked me to go back in the next 2 days." She paused. "If you don't like me, I'll go back today." Du Yueshing's head hurt. This girl was really cunning. But he wouldn't argue with her. He thought for a while and said, "Forget about what happened last night. You know how to deal with it in front of Liangqiu." His tone was very serious when he said that. Linda casually nodded and put the check away. When they were about to walk out, Du Yueshing said, "Why don't you want me to take responsibility?" Linda turned around and waved the check with an innocent look on her face. "I'm taking responsibility." The mature man's eyes were as calm as water as he looked at her. Linda couldn't pretend anymore and squeezed out a smile. "Mr. Du, I'm not interested in being a mistress. Besides, you're a little old." The corner of Du Yueshing's eyes twitched again. She raised her hand and said in a carefree manner, "All right, we can go now." Looking at her gave him a headache. At her age, if he had a child earlier, he would be around this age. Therefore, after he woke up, he didn't have any feelings for her. He didn't even look at her when she changed her clothes. Just like the sudden rise and fall of the wind, however, after Linda left, Du Yueshing still made a call. Half an hour later, his secretary knocked on the door and said in an emotionless voice, "Mr. Du, Miss Linda just went to the pharmacy to buy medicine and took it. I also found out that she booked a flight to New York in the afternoon." Du Yueshing was only wearing a bathrobe as he sat on the sofa. Despite being over 40 years old, his handsome face was still looking out the window. In front of him was an exquisite breakfast, and he seemed to be in a good mood. He ate gracefully and only took the time to ask, "Are you sure you bought morning after medicine?" The corner of the secretary's mouth twitched and he looked a little uncomfortable. It was true that Mr. Du was drunk last night, but he had never been so impulsive. The other party was just his secretary, and Mr. Du usually did not touch innocent women. Chapter 1842. Du Yueshing's voice sank. "Don't let Mr. Yi know about this. Do you understand?" The secretary nodded and thought to himself, "Whether Mr. Yi knows about this or not depends on whether you've sealed Miss Linda's mouth. All right, you can leave. Let me change the bed sheets." Du Yueshing wanted to rest after dealing with the matter. After all, he needed a good rest after indulging himself in the middle of the night and not sleeping all night. He was over 40 years old and paid special attention to his health. Just as the secretary was about to do it, Du Yueshing stopped him. "Forget it, there's no need to change it. Don't let anyone disturb me this morning." When he was alone and lying on the bed that smelled like a woman, he couldn't fall asleep. His body still naturally felt a little restless. He sighed. Perhaps he was really old and couldn't touch girls anymore. This liveliness really couldn't be stopped once he ate it. He got up and changed the bed sheets. Linda returned to the apartment. Other than feeling a little tired, there was nothing strange. When she returned, Yi Liangqiu was sitting on the recliner in front of the window. She was holding An in her arms and feeding the child. Her long hair was naturally scattered. She was wearing a white pajamas that was unbuttoned. She lowered her head and watched the little guy eat. There was an indescribable beauty in that scene. Linda silently swallowed her saliva as she looked at him. Her fingers unconsciously reached for her belly. Last night, the old man had sowed seeds, but she had just used a small pill to extinguish it. She wouldn't have children. But now, watching Mr. Yi feed the child, she felt a sense of desire in her heart. That kind of pink and tender little thing really made people unable to resist at all. Linda's vision was a blur, but soon, the appearance of a baby appeared. It had the body of a baby, but the face was Du Yueshing's old face. Ah, ah, ah. Linda shook her head and quickly woke up. She must be crazy to want to have a child with that old man. Crazy, crazy. She had to forget. She stared at it for a long time. Naturally, Yi Liangqiu noticed it. She glanced at her and said softly, "What's wrong?" He paused for a moment. "Why didn't you come back last night?" Linda let out a long "oh" and touched her head. I went to the bar with Kaim." Yi Liangqiu nodded lightly. Linda emphasized, "Mr. Yi, you don't know how bad Kim's tolerance is. In the end, I had to send him back." Yi Liangqiu glanced at her again and continued to feed the baby. Linda felt a chill down her spine. "Well, I'll go back to my room and take a shower first." That old fellow's stamina was abnormally good, but after sleeping with her, he was not so considerate and did not carry her to take a bath. However, the old fellow was probably out of energy. For the sake of the 10 million yuan, Linda was very understanding. She snorted and was about to leave when Yi Liangqiu said indifferently, "Kaim left New York last night." Linda was originally bending over, but now she paused and turned her head. "He didn't even tell me, where did you go last night?" Yi Liangqiu's gaze was very serious, reminding Linda of that old man. Sure enough, her choice was right. Mr. Yi and Mr. Du were from the same country, and even the tone of voice was quite similar. She touched her head, bit her lip, and squeezed out a charming smile. "Mr. Yi, you know. Fooling around." Chapter 1843. Yi Liangqiu's expression didn't change. She looked at Linda for a while before smiling faintly. "As long as it's fun." Linda bit her lip again. "I'm going to shower. I have a plane to catch." "Okay, as long as your legs aren't sore." Yi Liangqiu had always been calm. Her gaze made Linda's hair stand on end. She felt that it was better for her to be packed onto the plane as soon as possible. She was afraid that if this continued, she would expose herself. Actually, sleeping with him once wouldn't affect anything. If Mr. Yi liked Mr. Du, to be honest, that old man's skills weren't bad. Who knew how many women he had trained on? Last night, it would have been someone else. She wouldn't fight with Mr. Yi. So, she wouldn't do something as stupid as leaving Mr. Yi just to sleep with an old man once. Moreover, Mr. Yi might not like that old man. However, if Du Yueshing really got together with Mr. Yi, she thought that she would leave King Entertainment and not cause trouble for Mr. Yi. When Linda came out with her suitcase, she felt that she could lift it up and put it down. She came over and kissed Anin and Lon again. "I'm going back first. See you in a month, little babies." Yi Liangqiu called the driver to pick her up. She didn't ask why Linda brought the flight forward by 2 days. Linda left. Kaim, who said that he wasn't in New York, knocked on the door and came in. Yi Liangqiu looked up at him. Then, she put the 2 babies down. When she leaned over, she said faintly, "Go find out where Linda went last night." Kaim nodded. His expression was complicated. Yi Liangqiu knew very well that she had asked Linda to send Du Yueshing back last night. She looked up and paused. "Go check the GM surveillance. See what time Linda left the room." And when Linda came back, she was in a sorry state. She had always been a fan of details. How could she not see it? Kai made a few calls. After a while, he got a reply. At this moment, his mood was even more complicated. He wanted to say something but hesitated. It's 8 in the morning. What this meant was too clear. Linda and Du Yueshing slept together for the night. As for whether or not something had happened, there was no need to guess. Keim sympathized with Mr. Yi, so he dragged Du Yueshing over from 1,000 miles away. Unexpectedly, Du Yueshing slept with Linda on the first night. He pondered for a moment. Mr. Yi, how should we handle this? Yi Liangqiu replied without hesitation, keep it a secret. Now, KMG didn't understand what she was really thinking. Did she want to continue with Mr. Du or give it to Linda? Linda didn't seem to have that intention. Smart man. Yi Liangqiu didn't ask about Linda anymore. Instead, she asked something else. Is there any news from Anlin? Keim smiled faintly. President Qin met President Tang last night. Got it. Yi Liangqiu knew that it must be Tang Yu's intention. Keim left. She stood alone in the bedroom and looked at the New York sky through the window. Anlin, are you happier under such a sky? Is it because I'm forcing you to be in pain? She knew that he was deliberately avoiding it. He clearly knew his identity, but he didn't want to admit it. She couldn't expose him. She was just lonely, but he really felt pain. In the afternoon, Du Yueshing came over. Yi Liangqiu met him in the living room. Chapter 1844. Yi Liangqiu brewed a pot of British-style black tea and smiled at Du Yueshing. Why are you here? Du Yueshing looked around and smiled. Isn't it normal for a fiancé to visit his fiancée? I thought last night was just an act, she said in a low voice as she took a sip of tea from the cup. Du Yueshing looked at her and didn't notice anything strange. Plus, knowing that Linda had left, he heaved a sigh of relief. Although such a thing wasn't too important, it wasn't good to know. Now that it was erased, everyone would be happy. Think about it. I'm serious. Du Yueshing looked at the children again. I was married once, but I didn't get pregnant. The Du family also needs an heir. Liangqiu, if you don't want children after marriage or even want to live apart, it's fine. I can go to B City a few times a month. He was very sincere and gave her the greatest freedom. Moreover, he guaranteed the status of her children. Such conditions couldn't be said not to be moved. However, Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly and refilled his cup of tea. She asked slowly, Yueshing, do you love me? Du Yueshing was a little stunned by the way she addressed him. Such a gentle call was indeed very touching. However, he still hesitated for a moment before answering her question. Liangqiu, at my age, love isn't love. It's a little childish, but I like you and want to take care of you. Her face seemed to be a little disappointed. After a while, she smiled faintly. It's not love, she tilted her head. All right then, let's agree. If you like someone else before marriage and want to break the contract, that's fine too. Du Yueshing couldn't understand her intentions. It seemed like she had agreed, but it also seemed like she hadn't. However, it was better than refusing. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. Since that's the case, then Yueshing, go back to Hong Kong first, okay? Her tone was full of politeness, but he couldn't hear the self-awareness of a fiancé. How could someone like Du Yueshing not hear it? He suddenly had a feeling that he had been tricked by her. But thinking about it, her goal was nothing more than to make use of him, to work like a slave. Now, all she wanted to do was to find Qin Anlin. He was just an eyesore, thus, he said politely, then I'll visit you when you return to B City. She smiled and did not refuse. Du Yueshing left. When she reached the door, her expression froze. He felt that things were not that simple. Could it be that Liangqiu knew something? There was no reason. If she knew, even if she didn't care about him, she would ask him to be responsible for her little secretary. He knew that they had a good relationship. Therefore, after he slept with Linda, he felt that it was a little troublesome. Du Yuexing did as he said. When he returned to Hong Kong, he would send some things over from time to time. Sometimes it was a small item to make a girl happy, and sometimes it was a big deal. In short, Mr. Du's way of pursuing women was quite unique. Yi Liangqiu accepted all of them and didn't hide them. She was quite high profile. The Chinese newspapers were full of news about her and Du Yuexing, and her tacit consent was considered to be a stable relationship, on the top floor of a certain building on Wall Street. In an exquisitely decorated bedroom, a man dressed in black stood in front of the bar counter. There was a newspaper on the bar counter. Chapter 1845. In the exquisitely decorated bedroom, a man dressed in black stood in front of the bar. There was a newspaper on the bar. A silver mask covered half of his face. There was no expression on his face. Only a pair of black eyes revealed his true emotions. He held the wine in the glass, drank it in one gulp, and then crushed the glass. It was great. As he wished, she and Du Yuexing were exchanging flirtatious glances. It was really great. Wasn't this what he wanted? Why did he still feel a little sad in his heart? Was it because he was unwilling, or was it because he was unwilling? He felt a sense of anger rising in his lower abdomen, and it was difficult to calm it down. It had been half a month. He didn't look for her. She also treated him as heir and didn't look for him again. Qin Anlin, maybe she has forgotten you. Maybe she was scared by your appearance, maybe she has given up on you. The feelings you thought you had long been diluted. He reached out to touch his face, and the corner of his mouth curled into a self-deprecating smile. No one could tolerate such a husband. Don't even think about it. He endured for half a month, and finally couldn't help it. His reason told him not to provoke her, but his body, or the beast living in his body, made the decision to capture her again. He prepared a silk black nightgown for her, and when she fell asleep, he helped her change into it. He felt that he was a little perverted. When he helped her change into the nightgown, he kissed her body as if he was worshipping her. The whiteness was so perfect that he couldn't control himself. He kissed her a little hard and woke her up. When she opened her eyes, it was still dark in front of her, and her hands were tied. "It's you." Her voice was a little panicked, but she didn't scream or struggle. "Yes, it's me." His voice was hoarse, and he squinted to see her reaction. She might know it was him, or she might not know, but at this moment, when he kissed her, she was intoxicated. The light was dim, and she was bound by him in such an unbearable position. This situation was very ambiguous. He squinted his eyes, and his voice was deliberately hoarse. "Little thing, we meet again." Yi Liangqiu felt it for a moment. It was him. In his heart, he secretly cursed the pervert, but on the surface, he wore a blank expression. "You again. Don't you like it?" He got up, poured himself a glass of red wine, and stood, staring at her. He took a sip of the red wine. When he drank it, his throat rolled slightly. It was very sexy. His gaze seemed to be on fire as he stared at the seductive body. This was his wife, and he knew how beautiful she was, and how moving she was. He remembered the feeling of being buried in her. Her body instantly tensed up, and the glass in her hand tilted downwards. All the cold wine poured onto her body, staining her with a dark red hue. "No." She finally struggled out of uneasiness and bit her lip. "What do you want to do?" Her pajamas rolled up because of her struggle, and it was extremely seductive. Not only did she want to keep him, but she also wanted him. He kissed her, but he didn't do it. He kept kissing her. It wasn't until she was back down that she was able to let go of him. Hugging his shoulders, she moved up and touched a mask. His body froze for a moment. He looked up and said hoarsely, "If you take off the mask, I promise, the game will end." Game? He thought that this was a game. Chapter 1846. He was stunned. He probably hadn't expected her to say that. She wanted to touch him. His Adam's apple bobbed as he looked at her messy clothes. Her fair body was covered in dark red wine. That decadent look was enough to make any saint go crazy. Really? His voice was hoarse and ragged, but there was a mysterious power in it. "Are you sure you want to do this?" After she said it, he realized that he also desired it. He longed for contact with her. He longed for comfort in his exhausted soul. "You can let go of me first." Her voice was also slightly hoarse. Because she couldn't see, all her senses were based on her hearing. She heard the sound of the buttons rubbing against the fabric. One by one, the fabric was undone, and the light fabric was thrown on the floor. It was a soft sound, like a sigh. Her hands were untied, and then she was caught. That hand was like a pair of fire tongs, holding her firmly. She was a little timid and called out softly, "Anlin." This call was completely out of instinct. It came from the depths of her heart. Unconsciously, she voiced out the true feelings in her heart. In an instant, the air froze. He loosened his grip on her hand, and then tightened it again. His dark eyes narrowed as he stared at her face. His voice was unprecedentedly cold. "Yi Liangqiu, I'm not Qin Anlin." He couldn't take back the words that he had said. Yi Liangqiu stroked her chin. She was born pretty, especially her delicate collarbone. Now that it was stained with wine, she looked exceptionally seductive. His dark eyes looked at her. His Adam's apple couldn't help but loosen. He had an urge to press her down immediately. But what could he do if he pressed her down? His whole body seemed to be on fire, but there was still no movement from a certain part of his body. This made him feel defeated. Compared to appearance, men were more concerned about this. They were more concerned about whether they could conquer a woman in bed. She lifted her head and he couldn't see her, but she was able to hold his hand and prevent him from escaping. Her voice was a little forceful. "You said that you're not Anlin, so how do you know that my name is Yi Liangqiu and that my surname is Qin?" The man followed her strength and directly turned over. His body was tightly pressed against hers, and his thin lips also whispered in her ear, "You are my little prey, how could I not know everything about you?" As he spoke, his palms began to move down on her. With her eyes blindfolded, her eyelids moved the most. After a while, she started to pant. "And, did he do the same to you?" He kissed her slender white neck, his voice extremely husky. She knew that right now, she must be in a mess, tormented beyond recognition. She bit her lips and closed her eyes. "Believe me. He has done more than you. Like this, or like this." Every word he said was fatal. Looking at her expression, his heart also gave birth to a feeling that it was almost perverted. He felt that this was also quite good. The end, a hot sweat and a bout of emptiness were after all different. She lay down to calm herself down. Her fingers tugged at the silk bed sheets beneath her, causing a wrinkle to appear, but it added a touch of messy beauty. She was lying down so tenderly. If he said that he wasn't moved, he wouldn't be a man. Lying on his side, he looked at her with a burning gaze. "Is it comfortable?" Chapter 1847. Seeing her like this, he felt a sense of satisfaction in his heart. That feeling came so strangely and quickly. He stretched out his finger and gently stroked her delicate face. "Do you want to wash it?" he asked in a hoarse voice. She caught hold of his hand at once, and felt a special sensation. Even though they were husband and wife, her face was still blushing at the sight of the two of them. She closed her eyes slightly and said with a trembling voice, "Your hand, you haven't washed it." He paused for a moment. He had not thought of this. He had been rash just now, and now he had touched her face as he wished. He did not have the time to care so much. Moreover, she had never been so particular before. They had done things that were 100 times dirtier. They had shared it together. Suddenly, he thought of the past and had a sudden thought. He wanted to please her. His body suddenly heated up, and she felt it too. She gritted her teeth and said, "Don't do anything rash." Her hand pushed his shoulder, and he instinctively moved away. However, he did not expect that she would immediately tear off the cloth on his face. Even though it was dim, she could see him, his face, and even his body. Including the scar on half of his body, it was so shocking that it fell into her eyes. His heart ached so much that he could not breathe because he saw her pupils constrict. She cared about him. In that 1/10,000th of a second, besides heartache, she also felt fear. Yes, who would not be afraid after seeing this body? Even though they used to love each other so much, even though she used to be willing to die for him, his dark eyes were narrowed, and his whole body was filled with horror. Yi Liangqiu was stunned for a long time. She slowly reached out and touched his wound as if she was in a dream. Her voice was also trembling. "Does it still hurt?" His body trembled. He was sitting, and she was kneeling beside him, but she did not dare to take off his mask. That was the last trace of his pride. However, that half of his face had already betrayed the fact that he was Qin Anlin. She was kneeling, and her body was still in a mess, but she did not care. In her eyes, in her heart, there was only him and his wound. Her voice sounded like she was crying, and she called him Anlin. His body trembled as he looked at her with narrowed eyes. Her fair and slender fingers gently touched his wound. She didn't dare to use too much force for fear of breaking him. His tears never stopped. If she had behaved a little more forcefully, he could have pushed her away and coldly told her that he didn't care about her anymore. But she was crying. Moreover, she was so soft, and she had even been bullied by his fingers once. No matter what, even if it was just an act, he couldn't get angry at her. He could only look at her and watch her cry. His strong hand suddenly grasped hers, and his voice was extremely hoarse. "Yi Liangqiu, if you're smart, you should leave immediately." She tilted her head back and looked into his face. Familiar yet strange. Even though half of his face was intact, the expression in his eyes was different. His face was also extremely cold, as if it had been carved by a knife. Her fingers gently moved to where his heart was and pressed her tearful face against it. As she rubbed it, she asked softly, "Is this place of yours as hard as your body?" Qin Anlin was speechless. She really knew how to talk. Chapter 1848. Qin Anlin's eyes narrowed. He lowered his head and looked at the woman who was pressed against his chest. She was so hot, so soft, and so warm. It was his courage to struggle to live, not to live to be with her, but to live, to see her happy. He had never thought that he would be so popular. He was simply a Casanova. But when it came to it, he felt that everything was so natural. But what did she mean now? She was sobbing like a pear blossom in the rain, but she kept rubbing him with all her might and rubbing her face against his. She was not a virgin. Don't tell me that she didn't know that it was called seduction. If he was not, that, he would have pounced on her no matter what. She should know it clearly. Why did she still tease him like this? Qin Anlan's pain was that he wanted to, but he could not. It was not that he did not want to, but he could not. Looking at her, he would feel hot, he would want to, and he would even feel very tense and uncomfortable, but he just could not. It was as if all his strength was locked in a mysterious place in his body. He tried hard to break it, but he could not. After so many days, his injuries had already healed. Chi-Chi was 80 to 80%, but this place was useless. Not only to her, but he also did not have the reaction he should have had in the morning. At this moment, he felt even more uncomfortable when she was like this. He reached out and pushed her away. Have you had enough? With tears in her eyes, she looked up at him. Although she did not deny that she was acting and had the intention of seducing him. His injury was quite frightening. But he could not scare her away. Actually, this was quite a character. If she wanted to be more serious, she could treat her husband as a ferocious beast. Yi Liangqiu had never thought that she would have such a crazy idea. Not enough. She did not stand on ceremony with him. Why should she stand on ceremony with him? You lied to me by pretending to be dead, made me a widow, hooked up with another woman behind my back, and even kidnapped me to play such a perverted game. She sneered. Qin Anlan, I want to ask you, have you had enough? He froze for a moment. He didn't expect her to be so fierce. However, he quickly reacted. What about Duoxing? Duoxing? She gritted her teeth, and her finger impolitely poked his chest as she approached him step by step. His body was forced to move to the side of the bed. Thinking about it, his body was covered in glorious scars and he was also wearing a mask. He could not scare people, and in front of her powerful aura, he was like a weak little beast. It was also laughable. She stuck close to him and said in a particularly flirtatious voice, Duoxing, aren't you a good pimp for me? President Qin, have you forgotten? She raised her hand to play with her curly hair. I seem to have forgotten that President Qin doesn't exist anymore. In this world, there's only one man called King. Qin Anlan also sneered in a low voice. Yes, I was the good pimp for the widow. But even such a smart and beautiful Mr. Yi couldn't make an old man stay. His fingers pinched her chin, and his masked face came close to hers. He gently breathed out a warm breath. You were even cut off by your own little secretary. Oh, you just announced your engagement last night, right? How sad. Chapter 1849. Qin Anlan had undoubtedly stepped on her sore spot. Although she didn't care about Duoxing, she was probably rubbing Linda and Duoxing in her heart. The reason why she made this decision was that she knew that Linda was clean and had not been in a relationship for the past few years. Although Duoxing was a man who was used to seeing love and was an old man who had been married for 2 years, he was a well-behaved person. Mr. Yi didn't know that the glass of water was prepared for her at this moment, or else he would have been very upset. Moreover, old men doted on others, didn't they? They wouldn't be like Qin Anlan. After all, she had just gotten engaged last night and Duoxing had slept with Linda that night. This wasn't something to be proud of, especially when she was ridiculed by Qin Anlan. She looked into his eyes, and the corners of her mouth curled up into a pure smile. Her slender arms immediately circled around his neck, hugging him, not letting him escape. She smiled at him with her long hair wrapped around her body. The shoulder strap of her pajamas had long slipped down. She looked like she was going to die. Then it must be because I'm not charming enough to make Mr. Du stay, she whispered into his ear. Anlan, did you not teach me well in the past, huh? Yi Liangqiu had a cold look and was a standard goddess, but at this moment, she deliberately acted like this. It was enough to stir up any man's hormones. Not to mention 1 Duyueshing, even 10 Duyueshing could be easily taken down. It was the same for Qin Anlin. Even 10 Qin Anlin and the current 10 kings couldn't resist her charm. His Adam's apple kept moving as he controlled himself from hugging her. She was completely a little vixen now. The little vixen bit his ear and continued to plead, "Anlin, teach me, huh?" All the lines of defense collapsed, that string was broken. Was this the reaction an ex-husband and wife who had experienced life and death should have? Shouldn't she be crying to check if there was anything wrong with his body? Shouldn't she be hugging him and crying? Why was she seducing him? He didn't understand, and he couldn't figure it out no matter how hot his brain was. He could only stare at her. He could only stare at her without saying a word. Seeing him like this, Yi Liangqiu felt that it was about time. She had thought that he was so promising now, but it turned out that half of his brain was still in the lower half of his body. Once the sperm entered his brain, he couldn't think anymore. She yawned and hugged his waist instead. "It's getting late. Anlin, do you want to sleep?" His body was still stiff. None of this was within his expectations. He didn't even know what to do with her, or rather, he couldn't see through her heart. What was she thinking? Did he want him to go back? It was impossible for him to go back. It was unnecessary to be her husband. He could not give her anything. For a moment, he could use his hands, or even use, but as time passed, she would find out. She wasn't a little girl who could be easily fooled. Yes, if she was gullible, he would be willing to lie to her for the rest of his life, but he couldn't. He lowered his head and looked at her. His voice was a little hoarse. "I'll get someone to send you back. You should feed the child." She raised her head. There was an emotion in her eyes that he couldn't understand. She said very slowly, "Qin Anlin, you've eaten them all. And Anlin will probably only be able to make milk powder." His body trembled and he turned his face to the side. Chapter 1850. Yi Liangqiu looked at his face and said slowly, "I'll take a shower first. You can decide slowly." She paused. "If you send me away, there's a possibility that I won't come back unless you kidnap me again. But Anlin, I don't have a man now. If I have a man one day, will you still want to maintain this relationship with me? Share me with someone else?" With that said, she curled her lips. "Tie me up here, pour me red wine, kiss me, and touch me." She got up and walked in the direction of the bathroom as if she was familiar with it. Before closing the bathroom door, she threw a sentence at him. "Or do you like to touch married women now?" If he had something in his hand, he would have thrown it at her without hesitation. It was too hateful. Her little mouth was too hateful. She clearly knew, but she still angered him like this. Qin Anlin got up and casually picked up his shirt and put it on. He then walked to the living room and stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window, looking at the New York night. Although he was angry at her for calling him a scoundrel, he heard every word. She was right. His identity had been exposed. Actually, even if it hadn't been exposed, it was something he was well aware of. He couldn't forget it, so he appeared in front of her again and again, exposing himself. He hadn't done it thoroughly. He hadn't been ruthless enough. In the end, he still had a glimmer of hope in his heart. He still yearned for her to love him. Even though he was in such a terrible state now, even though he was inferior to Du Yueshing in terms of appearance, body, and other aspects, and was actually inferior to an ordinary man, he still yearned for her. Otherwise, he wouldn't have tied her up. To stay or to leave, he was in a dilemma. Yi Liangqiu stood behind him in his bathrobe, looking at his back. "Anlin, you might think that I'm willful, but you're even more willful than I am." Her voice was extremely clear in the dark night, and every word sounded like pearls falling. You arranged all of this for me, but have you ever thought about whether it's what I want? Her voice was a little choked. His heart suddenly tightened, and he clenched his fists, trying to resist the urge to hug her. You said that you're dead, but you're still alive. You probably think that you won't be able to endure it and that you might die, right? She continued to speak in a very soft voice. Do you know, I'd rather experience the pain of losing you twice. I don't want you to be alone. His body trembled. Finally, he slowly turned around and looked at her. He looked at her in his bathrobe. She looked elegant, no longer as charming as before. Her expression was very uneasy and timid. She looked very much like the little girl he had spent $500,000 to sleep with. He opened his mouth and his voice was unbelievably hoarse. Yi Liangqiu, where is your aura? Where's your fierceness just now? She was still standing there with tears in her eyes. I was eaten by a dog. Her words were not pleasant to hear, but they struck him hard at the bottom of his heart, making his heart ache and feel extremely uncomfortable. He also knew that she was a Best Actress and had won many awards. Even international directors had said that she was a gift from God. With that cold face of hers, she was able to speak like a human being and speak like a ghost. However, he still believed in the ghost that she had spouted now. Liangqiu, he sighed, why must you be so persistent? Chapter 1851. Yi Liangqiu's teary eyes seemed to be covered by a layer of mist, and she was wearing a clean bathrobe. Really, if she wanted to be an angel, she would be an angel. If she wanted to be a slut, she would be a slut. Besides using her acting skills on the big screen in the past, she had been using them on him ever since. He stared at her delicate and adorable face. His gaze was very cold, but she still stood there, unmoved. She did not retreat, nor did she take a step forward. She was waiting for him to take the initiative to come over. He did not know how torturous it was for her to know that he was still alive. She knew that he was lying in the hospital, knew that he was still alive, and even knew that his life was hanging by a thread, but she pretended that she did not know anything. Everything was for his pride, for his painstaking arrangements. Anlin, I'm not made of iron. I don't blame you, I don't resent you, and I don't have the right to do this. But now, you're standing in front of me. Although you're not perfect, I still want you. She did not force him, she wanted him to come over himself. Qin Anlin, if you're a man, get over here, take off that ghost mask, hug me openly, and kiss me. She did not want to be separated from him by anything anymore. In the dim light, his eyes seemed to be burning with a small flame, so bright that it could ignite her entire world. Her tears fell like rain, and her body began to tremble, her lips were trembling, and she could not say a word. This time, it was not an act. She had a feeling that he was about to make a decision. She said hoarsely, Qin Anlin, think about it carefully. If you don't come over here now, I'll go out and find a man, a few men. There was some bravado in her words. In the end, she didn't have enough confidence. Because right now, his heart was really perverted. She even suspected that he would say, let's play together. She stood there for a long time, as though she was standing in another world. Her legs felt like they were filled with lead. He finally said, Yi Liangqiu, you've grown up, huh? He took a step forward and pinched her sharp chin. Lowering his eyes, he gazed at her. Take my money to find a man, huh? She pursed her lips. I can find it without spending money. Do you believe it? She pulled down her bathrobe. Qin Anlin closed his eyes and cursed, Yi Liangqiu, you're a fucking demon. Her eyes were bright. She knew him very well, so how could she not know that his perseverance was beginning to crumble? No matter how strong his protection was, it was no match for her amazing acting skills. She spoke with a nasal voice. If you don't like it, I can also be a pure and innocent saintess every day. Half of his face and the other half of his mask had turned black. He gritted his teeth. Yi Liangqiu. Or, you can call me little sweetheart. She squeezed out a sweet smile with tears in her eyes. Qin Anlin brusquely wiped away the tears on her face. His actions were not gentle at all, and his words were even less courteous. Yi Liangqiu, you're almost 30, aren't you? You have the cheek to ask me to call you little sweetheart. I believe there will be people who will be willing. There was a hint of malice in her eyes. Anyway, Du Yuexing's relationship with Linda hasn't been exposed yet. I can still marry him, and then what? Let Linda be his concubine. She smiled happily. That's pretty good. We'll be a happy family. She stabbed him again. Do you think it's Anlin? Chapter 1852. The veins on Qin Anlin's forehead were popping, as though they were about to explode. You don't agree? She chuckled. Wasn't this arranged by you? I like Linda too. It's pretty good. He laughed coldly. You're quite magnanimous. He pinched her cheek forcefully. She cried out in pain and stared at him with tears in her eyes. Qin Anlin's voice was tense. You were so fierce just now. Why aren't you like that now? He hadn't put his hand down and kept pinching her face. She bit her lip and glared at him. Qin Anlin pinched her again. As she cried out in pain, he said in a deep voice, Now, you're like the little girl from before. Yi Liangqiu's heart skipped a beat. She looked up at him. Then you're willing to let your little girl marry an old man and share him with other women? She wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed her body against him. Do you want me to serve him like this at night? With that, she kissed the wound on his neck with a devout look. She wasn't scared at all. His body froze, not because of the love jade, but because of shock. Because of what she was doing to him now. His voice was tense and he narrowed his eyes. You really don't care. Care about what? She looked down. Her face was pressed against his mask, and her voice was a little shaky. Anlin, do you care about your injury? Or do you care about your little secretary, HM? He lowered his head and looked at her. His voice was even more hoarse. You won't like it. Whether I like it or not, we'll only know after we see it. She kissed his lips directly. She didn't go deep, but just murmured against him, maybe it's heartache. Her long eyelashes fluttered. She opened her eyes and looked into his eyes. Anlin, I still feel it. To your body, to your person. Her hands moved down slowly and hugged his waist. Anlin, do you still feel it? He looked down, a little speechless. If he didn't feel anything, why did he kidnap her? Did they really think he was a pervert? Seeing him glaring at her, Yi Liangqiu smiled. Her smile was a little sweet, and then very emotional. Anlin, I don't care what you look like. You are you. You are Qin Anlin, my husband. We're divorced. His voice was husky as he kindly reminded her. She deliberately teased him, her little hands rubbing here and there. Then how about I marry Du Yuexing? Every night, I sleep beside him. He wants to kiss me, he wants me. Anlin, should I reject him? At the end of her sentence, she was already moaning softly because he had suddenly grabbed her hand and gripped it tightly. She moaned softly and said that it hurt. Her voice was as sweet as honey. Anlin, what do you say? His face darkened. What did you just say? Didn't you just say that you want me to return to your side, and now I'm going to marry an old man? He was tormenting her too much. She could only moan softly and put her face on his shoulder, hanging down weakly for a while. After a long time, she raised her head again. This old man was also arranged by you. Looking at her was really hateful. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was a very, very deep kiss, so deep that it hurt her. She clenched her fists and hammered his shoulder, begging desperately, but he couldn't let it go. Regaining what he had lost was the only thing he missed at this moment. This kiss became intense. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.